Well, this is quite a panel to be on. I'm really honored by the invitation, Leo, and to be up here with these other great panelists. I do believe my role today here is to be the conservative on the panel. I'm willing to take that challenge on. I'm glad to see, by the way, that regardless of the audience, in every location we have the same problem with nobody wanting to sit right up front. I've never quite seen this triangular formation before. I'm not sure what that's about. People, come on over from the sides. You can watch us directly instead of the screens. But that's fun to see. I also love the fact that Twitter now allows me to rebut my friend Rick Collenberg in real time while he's making his presentation. You won't even see those tweets until the end of this panel, Rick. And by then, I'll have won the debate long ago. I'm only half kidding. But what I want to address today are really two questions. And look, I'll be honest, I don't mind being the contrarian, but it is challenging to be on a panel as the conservative when you're talking about issues of race, right? Because for sure, conservatives as a whole have not had a great history on many of these issues of race. So I understand the sensitivity of those. At the same time, I'm not going to back down from making some very strong and perhaps provocative arguments about how we should think about this issue going forward. So there's really two questions. One is, should we take opportunities to integrate our schools where those opportunities exist? And that's an easy question. The answer is obviously yes. And we'll talk about why that is and how we can do that. But the second question is, should we take extraordinary measures to integrate our schools, to consider busing again, to consider getting rid of neighborhood school zones, to really take the extraordinary action that it would take because of our situation around housing segregation that could lead to significant integration of our schools. And here I would argue the answer is no. That would be cost us a lot of money, but more importantly, political capital that could be better spent in other ways and in other school reforms. And Rick made a reference to this about the school reform agenda, but that school reform agenda, there's a reason why the focus is on making high poverty schools work, is that strategy is both showing some promise and also is just frankly much more feasible than taking extraordinary measures to integrate all of our schools. All right, so first of all, let me just say why I don't dismiss the idea of taking opportunities to integrate our schools entirely. As Rick made the case, there is some very compelling evidence that integrated schools do better by their students than schools that have a lot of high concentrations of poverty. Now, my own view is that Rick overstates the evidence, and so I'll give him a hard time on some of this. Mentioning the NAEP studies are 22 times as likely to be high performing. Look, all of these studies that we've relied on for so many years, they suffer from real selection bias problems. Just as many of you in this room would call me out if I said, as a conservative, minority kids in Catholic schools outperform minority kids in public schools, and therefore Catholic schools are more effective than public schools. You would rightfully say, wait, there's a big selection bias problem here. There's something different about the minority kids that are getting into those Catholic schools, and so we have to take that into account. Well, same thing here, and it's a huge issue. And so then you really have to say, okay, what is the evidence that minority children or low-income children do better in integrated schools? When I was researching this subject for a book, I found basically 3 studies. Okay, the one that Rick talked about by Heather Schwartz from Montgomery County, which, by the way, it would be very helpful to the cause to have that study be in a peer-reviewed journal, which I don't think it has yet, but that would, because there's plenty of skeptics out there about those findings. And then a couple of studies, one by Eric Hanushek and another by Caroline Hawksby, not known as being big flaming liberals themselves, okay? But very interesting quasi-experimental studies where they looked at schools. I think it was maybe the data set was from Texas, but schools where there were these random variations of student demographics from year to year. And what they were able to show was, in fact, in classrooms where there were high concentrations of minority children, the minority children tended to perform worse, significantly worse. And it was particularly the case for African Americans and particularly the case for African American boys. So for an African-American boy to be in a classroom where all of the children are minority children seem to be, a significant disadvantage. And so those studies, to me, are quite compelling. Now, notice, that's looking at classrooms. Those are classrooms that are integrated, which is an important thing to note, as we'll get to in a moment. Now, the evidence on whether this is helpful or harmful for white students, I think, is less settled. I think, more or less there's good evidence that is not harmful for white students or for middle-class students. Some of the benefits that are ascribed to diversity around, becoming more open to and accepting of people from different races, a lot of that is pretty anecdotal. I mean, it makes sense, and I think, I'm willing to certainly say, sure. I mean, on its face, that makes sense, that kids who go to schools that are integrated are going to benefit in that way. But frankly, the hard evidence is pretty weak when you start to dig into that question. All right, so, but still, all that said, I would argue that particularly because of the student achievement impacts that you can find in some of the research for minority children, this is certainly something that we should pursue when feasible. So what should we do? Well, there are opportunities to promote integrated schools, right? Rick mentioned these controlled choice programs in some of these districts where there is some ability, particularly via magnet schools, to create integrated schools. There are an increasing number of charter schools that are being designed purposefully from the ground up to be diverse, where educators are saying this is something we care about. We believe in integrated schools, and so we are going to try to create a program like magnet schools that is attractive to white and black and Latino families, rich and poor. We're going to locate the charter schools strategically in the center of the city or in a place maybe on the border between communities. Maybe the communities themselves are quite segregated in terms of housing, but they're in close proximity, and so we'll put the charter school right there. We see this in Washington, D.C. Right now with a number of schools that have opened in recent years that are being located in places like Columbia Heights, where you can draw from lots of different communities and create a quite diverse setting. And so where there are opportunities, we should seize those opportunities. And there may be some cases where an assist from public policy can help. So the U.S. Department of Education recently came out with a decision around charter schools, for example, that finally said if a charter school wants to use a weighted lottery in order to create a more diverse student body, it is allowed to do so. Until this decision a few months ago, that was not allowed for charter schools that wanted to get some of the federal charter school startup money. And that was a big problem. So this is progress. We've also been making the case to funders in the charter school world that they shouldn't just fund the highest poverty charter schools, which is what they were doing for many years, saying, well, we want to serve the neediest kids, so therefore we're going to only give you a grant if 90% of your kids are in poverty. But to say, well, actually, there's a lot of benefit from having diverse schools, and so please make sure that these integrated schools, maybe that are 50% poverty, are a part of your portfolio as well. And there is some progress in that direction. Okay, so where there are opportunities, right, either because neighborhoods are integrated or segregated neighborhoods are close to one another and you can strategically locate schools, or you can have magnet schools where parents voluntarily are sending their kids to these schools, absolutely we should do it. And by the way, we did a study a year ago on what parents want from their schools, looking at different niches, and there's definitely a segment of the parent population that says that integrated schools are very important to them, much more important than most other factors. And so it's important to give those parents that option as well. And sometimes that takes an assist from public policy. Okay. But should we take extraordinary measures, right? I mean, the most extraordinary would be saying we're going to go back to large-scale busing. When you look at a metro area, most metro areas, you look at these maps that places like the Atlantic Monthly and others put out, and it's pretty stark. I mean, we still have a huge degree of housing segregation, right? And you would think, wow, if we're going to have integrated schools, at least many, many more integrated schools than we have now, you would need some kind of massive busing for that to happen. Now, maybe that's a straw man. Maybe nobody in this room is actually contemplating going down that path again. Okay, but that would be an extraordinary measure. A step down would be some of what Rick talked about with the controlled choice. Certainly, magnet schools is not extraordinary. That's easy. That's voluntary. But the idea of getting rid of neighborhood school zones strikes many people as quite extraordinary. And that proposal was floated here in Washington, D.C. recently. And as you may have heard, that has not gone over so well with the public. And now you have the mayoral candidates in D.C. scrambling to make it clear that they still support neighborhood school zones. This idea that parents have a right to send their kid to the school closest to them, which is not the case in these controlled choice systems. So the question then is, is it worth it enough? Is the cause of integrated schools strong enough that we should put much more of our energy into overcoming some of the political resistance and the logistical problems of making it happen, right? And here's where I would say no, right? For a couple of reasons. First of all, I do think it's not logistically feasible or politically feasible to go too far down this road. I mean, all the polls show whites, blacks, rich, poor, everybody says they want neighborhood schools. They want to fix the schools closer to their home. They don't want to return to busing or anything that looks like it, right? The other thing is that integration, for all the benefits we've heard about today, is hard, right? And there are some real dilemmas that take place. And some of these dilemmas are hard to resolve in ways that are going to end up meaning that we're going to get the full impact of integration. So in other words, you go into a lot of schools in this country that on paper are integrated, and we all know you go into classrooms and you found out that they're not integrated at all. Right, that in fact, most of the wealthier kids are in the advanced courses and most of the poor kids are in the more remedial courses. And so I hear many on the left saying, well, we disagree with that. That is just segregation by another name. And so we are against any form of tracking or ability grouping. We need to have then all kids together in those same classrooms. But even Rick has acknowledged, and I keep picking on you, Rick, I hope you don't mind, but he's so knowledgeable about this stuff. But he has acknowledged that to make this politically feasible, you have to allow for some ability grouping. And the reason is that, think about an elementary school. We know that low-income kids come into school with such enormous disadvantages, right? And that affluent kids increasingly are coming into school with such great advantages that when you look out at a kindergarten class and you're the teacher, right, you have an enormous range of kids from some kids who literally don't know their letters or numbers yet, right, or maybe learning the English language, and other kids who are already reading Harry Potter. And how do you deal with that academic diversity? Now, public schools have this issue regardless, right? Regardless of the demographics, there's going to be a spread of kids. But when you're talking about very, very poor kids and very, very wealthy kids in the same classroom, that spectrum is going to be that much wider. And, oftentimes the education system's answer is, well, we need to, quote, differentiate instruction. Right, and when I've talked to my teacher friends about this, they have a technical term that they use for this. They say bullshit is the technical term they use. They say, wait a minute, you're going to tell me that I'm magically going to find a way to, quote, differentiate instruction so I can reach all these kids at maybe who might be 3, 4, 5, 6 grade levels apart at the same time. That's total bullshit, right? Excuse my language. And so you get into situations where you say, well, to do that, what you really need to do is start talking about some ability grouping. You have the Harry Potter readers over in this reading group, at least for part of the day, and the kids learning their letters over here for part of the day. As they get older, do you really say that you're not going to allow the kids who are ready for advanced mathematics to go forward with that? You're going to hold them back. But when you start to allow some ability grouping and you start to let some tracking creep in, you are likely to find these things to play out based on socioeconomic status, right, in general. Now, all of our reforms are trying to address that, right, to make that less the case. But right now, that's the case. So what I am saying is that when you try to integrate schools, what you often have are integrated schools but not integrated classrooms. And the studies that I find most compelling about the benefits of diversity show that the classroom has to be integrated. So that is then a conundrum. And that means that perhaps we don't get the same impact on student achievement from integrated schools that some of these studies may indicate. Now, it still may be that, as Rick said, you get a benefit from being in a school where you have a lot of these parents who are politically well-connected, who know how to make noise with the school board, who can get a bad teacher kicked out of the school, who can get the central district office to deal with a leaky roof. All of those benefits, so that's there, right? But let's be let's be honest about the fact that, and more humble about the impact that all of that is going to have. It's going to be relatively modest. Okay. So, to my eyes, extraordinary measures leading to modest outcomes doesn't make a lot of sense compared to some of the other strategies we're pursuing today, right? So, in the school reform movement, we see promise in, say, some of the high-performing charter school networks. You go to a place like Boston, where the charter schools there are outperforming their local district schools, and the Boston public schools are quite good compared to many urban schools, but those charter schools are outperforming those district schools dramatically, right, year after year, in reading and in math. Now, you don't see that everywhere. We do a lot of work in Ohio. That is not the case in Ohio, okay? But some cities have figured out how to have really strong charter school sectors, and they tend to be dominated by these, quote, no excuses charter schools that are just super focused on achievement, longer school day, longer school year, help teachers build their capacity to serve these kids well. All of these efforts around improving teacher quality, paying more attention to curriculum, following E.D. Hirsch's lessons from the last 30 years about the importance of a content-rich curriculum, all the different pieces of school reform that are starting to show some significant impacts, at least in a limited number of schools. I think that is still where there's a reason why so much school reform is focused on that. I think that is both where there's the most promise, it's where there's the most political support, and it's where we're starting to move the ball. And so I would argue that to reverse the, if you wanted to go from 95% to 90% of the focus on that stuff versus this stuff, okay. But I certainly would have a big concern if we tried to flip those ratios entirely. Thank you.